ask the question again and I'll try and listen closer.
Yes, many violinists believe that souls of their previous owners, players, are trapped inside violins. I think that's what you actually said to me. And
Yeah.
So that made me curious, because it seems to me, absolutely, I've always considered that when I've inherited things. So, for example, that bookshelf behind me belonged to an old lady in our street. And I feel her presence at times, right? And so that's an example. But you're saying that violins, Ursula Donnelly in Thailand, the violinist, what is her experience of a haunted violin?
Well, I think you saw the video with her commentary afterwards. So what we're talking about is a violin of a particular type that many expert luthiers claim was made by a violin maker called Tobin, who was an Irish violin maker. He was noted as one of the best scroll makers of violins at the time, probably throughout the world. But he was frequently impecunious, in other words, frequently in poverty. And he actually died in the workhouse in Victorian times. And he was reduced to making violins for a violin company called Betts of London, which were basically, they were faking violins of a century earlier. So we're in the 19th century now, and they were faking 18th century violins because their excellent violins of their own modern making couldn't compete with German imports. So they were making violins look like they were Italian masters. Right. And the particular violin that Ursula played, and she felt that when she heard the E string cry, if you actually watch the video, you can see her facial expression change, like, oh, what was that? And she put in her description of the violin later that, like many professional violinists, they do feel like previous owners have left their mark on a violin. And they describe this, some of them describe this as leaving their soul in the violin. It's an old idea that goes back almost the beginning of when violins came into the West from the East, and the church didn't like them because they were portable instruments, and they thought that they were the work of the devil, and they were played in baldy houses, and people were dancing and things like this. And, you know, the church didn't like it. So violins became associated with the devil, an idea of ghosts and haunting.
Right, exactly. Now, that is interesting. So Ursula's experience, how has that impacted her? Because that's quite a creepy experience, isn't it, really, to have that? You know, you're a violinist and you hear, you know, what appears to be a scream. That's creepy. That's not a regular everyday experience.
Yeah. Well, it you know, ghost stories, creepiness, Halloween. It's the time of year for this sort of thing. I don't think violinists actually get creeped out by it. I mean, there is you know, as you know, some of my work is in science. I'm a social scientist, and there is actually a scientific explanation for the phenomenon. It's long been held by violinists and violin dealers that a violin, the more it's played, the better it sounds. Now that's spooky in a way to me, because the thing's made of wood, really, and, you know, made to particular measurements. But isn't it interesting that the more it's played, the better it sounds? How many things in the world sound better for being used? You know, my car's got over 100,000 miles on the clock. It's not getting any better. Neither am I.
Right. Well, who is?
Improve with wear and tear.
Yeah.
Now, so there is a scientific explanation that if a really good violinist has played it, maybe also, so conveniently, the better the violinist, the better the violin.
Wow, yeah.
It does be proven now that it's not actually a myth. It does change the molecular structure of the wood.
Wow. I mean, that in itself is quite mind-blowing, isn't it, Sean?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that just proves us a lot about frequency and sound as a whole, and how much that energy can, you know, everything is based on frequency and sound. I'm held together with the same. So that's so interesting that it can affect. And also, you got to think about the emotion that goes into the music, and the pain and sorrow, or all these, like, it's like a living extension, isn't it, of like someone's pain or trauma or happiness. Or
and Mike, you're interested.
Yeah, I mean, I can pick up on that. Paganini, when asked, because the church thought Paganini, the great violinist, was a devil, A priest came up and checked he didn't have cloven hooves when he came up on stage.
Dear Lord.
And they said, have you trapped, and there's these stories that he'd trapped the souls of a past lover in his violin and used her guts for the strings, etc.
Wow.
These stories abound. And Paganini said, no, it's my soul that's trapped in the violin. And there's this story that the neck on the was warped and he took it to a luthier. And every time the luthier drove his chisel in, because you'd have to separate the neck from the violin to fix a particular problem he had, that he cried out in pain.
Wow.
He said it was his soul that was in the violin. So these notions of you imparting something of yourself into the wood, it runs throughout the violin community. I watched a documentary recently about Stradivari violins, and
right.
One of those great players said the same thing, that it had been played by this great player and it clearly left his mark on it. So you can see where this notion of trapped souls comes from.
I think the violin is one of the most hauntingly beautiful instruments that we have. I truly do. And Mike, are you involved in violin restoration?
Yeah. I mean, the violin that Ursula plays on the video is this one here. I'll try and get it for the camera. Can you?
There we go. See it? Yeah.
So this is one that I fixed. It's a fake violin with a number of fake cracks on it, and this is a genuine crack, but all the other cracks and the woodworm holes, they're all fake. That was faked in the 19th century to make it look like it was 100 years older then.
Wow.
So this is the so-called haunted violin.
Right. Mike is great on detecting fakes. This is one of his absolute things.
Just so you can see what it goes through very briefly. So this isn't to trap a soul inside, by the way.
Good.
This is the top of a violin being glued back on. So that's that's an old violin that's being fixed at the moment. That had the same repair that Paganini's violin had done to it.
And what is it you're doing in terms of Patrick Matthew? Patrick Matthew, of course, let me remember the story correctly. Patrick Matthew is, you claim, the original creator of Darwin's theory of origin. We've got that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. The theory that's in the Origin of Species, the theory of evolution by natural selection.
Theory of, absolutely. And you are completing the Patrick Matthew violin next year. Tell us a little about that.
Well, there are a number of violins that have been made in Scotland to celebrate great Scottish science heroes and explorers. And there's one violin maker, I won't name him at the moment,
right? But
there's one master violin maker in Scotland who I've commissioned him to the Patrick Matthew violin. And it'll use timbers that are heavily related to what Matthew did. So we'll incorporate some timbers from Scotland in there, from various parts of the Scottish environment.
Wow, that literally is bringing it all full circle, really. Patrick Matthew needs to be remembered. He needs to be remembered, and what a phenomenal way to remember him. I mean, there'll be people who listen to this and go, that can't possibly be right what he's saying. This is a doctor. He's on here making these outrageous claims. What would you say to them, Mike?
Well, I'd say that many great long-lived explanations for certain phenomenon and things have been debunked by new facts. And I would ask someone, well, if you read new facts that come along that shake your beliefs or what you've been told to the core, do you deny that those facts exist? Do you ignore them and carry on with your beliefs like a religious believer or a believer in ghosts? or do you take those facts and say, well, these facts are verifiable and they actually do absolutely disprove what I was told before? So very briefly, they said no one read Matthew's book. Darwin said it contained the full theory of evolution by natural selection. The scientific consensus ever since, but Darwin said no one read Matthew's book, and I didn't read it. And all I simply did was use big data to say, well, who cited Matthew's book? Who might have mentioned it in the literature? And there we find all of Darwin's major influences had cited it before Darwin or Wallace, the other so-called independent originator, had even put pen to paper on the topic. So you've got Darwin surrounded by men whose brains are fertile with Matthew's idea, and we know that because they cited it in the literature, and that's there, it's in the literature before Darwin even put pen to paper on the topic. And yet Darwin and Wallace claimed that despite being surrounded by men whose brains were influenced by the theory, had an independent, if you like, virgin conception of the same theory.
Of course they did.
So, I mean, Darwinists, as you know, are major atheists, and they mock ideas of miraculous virgin conceptions. Well, if they don't take these facts on board and deal with them, they've got a belief in a dual independent miracle virgin brained conception of a theory of which their friends' brains were all fertile.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And remind us.
You have a religious belief.
Absolutely. And remind us before you go the title of that book.
So the title of the book is Science Fraud,
There you go.
Darwin's Plagiarism of Patrick Matthews' Theory.
There you
Wow.
go. We started off with spiritual violins and ended up with a science fraud. Dr. Mike Sutton, everybody. Have a terrific week, Mike. Take good care of yourself. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Sonia, and sorry about the sound problem.
Not at all.
Yeah,
Not
cheers,
at all.
Mike.
Take care. Good to see you.
Okay,
Lovely to meet
bye-bye.
you.
Excellent to see you. What a lovely story,
Cheers.
Sean.
Sean.
Absolutely.
Wow, how interesting.
Lovely story.